research team has successfully located the wreckage of the USS Juno in the South Pacific. Japanese forces sank the U.S. light cruiser in the fall of 1942 during the Battle of Guadalcanal.
The story of the five Sullivan brothers is a tragedy every American knows. They all served on one ship and they all perished together. But the ship itself, the USS Juneau, held secrets that the history books left out. When the Research Vessel Petrel finally located the wreckage, the images sent back to the surface were haunting. The guns were still aimed. The blast shields were twisted by an unimaginable force. But it was the condition of the interior that silenced the experts. It looks like the crew just left 5 minutes ago, and deep inside, the ocean is hiding something else. The moment the screen lit up. The ocean is a master at hiding things. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. So when the crew of the Research Vessel Petrel set out to find the USS Juno, they knew the odds were stacked against them. This wasn't just a treasure hunt. It was a mission to close a wound that had been open for 76 years. The area they were searching is known as the Solomon Islands. During World War II, this place was hell on earth. Today, the surface is beautiful, calm, and turquoise. But below, it is a jagged, chaotic nightmare of underwater mountains and deep trenches. The Petrel is owned by the estate of Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. He poured millions into building a ship that could go where no one else could. The star of the show is the Autonomous Underwater Vehicle, or AUV. This isn't a guy in a suit. It is a yellow robot, packed with sonar and 4K cameras capable of diving to depths that would crush a nuclear submarine. On March 17, 2018, the team lowered the AUV into the water. The target depth was staggering, 13,800 feet. That is nearly 3 miles of water pressing down. As the robot descended, it traveled through the midnight zone. The sunlight fades away completely after a few thousand feet. After that, it is total, eternal darkness. The temperature drops to just above freezing. It is an alien world. The team in the control room watched the sonar feed. For hours, they saw nothing but mud and rock. It is a boring, tense game of waiting. You are staring at a screen, hoping for a straight line. Nature doesn't make straight lines. Only humans do. Then it happened. A sharp artificial shape appeared on the sonar. The room went quiet. They maneuvered the AUV closer and turned on the high-intensity floodlights. The darkness was pushed back and suddenly a wall of steel appeared. It wasn't a rock. It was the stern of a warship. And there, incredibly, the letters were still visible. Juno. The experts were silent. Usually, ships that have been down this long are covered in thick layers of marine growth. They look like fuzzy reefs. But at this depth, the chemistry of the ocean is different. There is very little oxygen. There is almost no food for marine life. So the ship wasn't covered in life. It was naked. It looked like it had been placed there yesterday. But here is the catch. As the drone moved along the side of the ship, the awe turned into horror. The ship wasn't whole. The metal was twisted and shredded in a way that looked unnatural. Giant steel plates, inches thick, were ripped apart like wet cardboard. The drone piloted over the deck. The experts saw the anti-aircraft guns. They were rusted, sure, but they were still pointing up. They were locked in the position they were in on the morning of November 13, 1942. The crew was fighting until the very last second. The camera peered into the dark openings of the hull. This is where the silence in the control room got heavy. They weren't just looking at a machine. They were looking at a tomb. Inside the wreckage, they could see cables, walkways, and equipment. The preservation was so good that it felt intrusive. It felt like they were spying on a moment that was supposed to be private. The crazy part is the debris field. The bow and the stern were found about half a mile apart. This confirmed the reports from the war. The ship didn't sink, it snapped. The force required to throw half a cruiser that far away is mind-boggling. The Submersible found the propellers. They were bent, but not from hitting the bottom. They were bent from the torque of the engines running at full speed when the ship died. The Juno was running for its life when it was caught. This visual confirmation settled a decades-old debate. Some people thought the ship had capsized. Others thought it broke slowly. The wreckage proves it was instant. The experts stared at the screens, realizing that 687 men never stood a chance. But to understand why the ship is in pieces and why the experts were so shaken by the violence of the wreck, we have to go back to the night it happened. We have to look at the barroom brawl that sealed the Juno's fate. And get this, the explosion that sent her to the bottom was just the final blow in a night of absolute madness. The ocean floor is silent, but the story it tells is deafening. Flash and fire. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the ship. The USS Juno was an Atlanta-class light cruiser. She was beautiful, she was fast, capable of hitting 32 knots. She was designed to be an anti-aircraft platform, bristling with guns to protect aircraft carriers. But speed comes at a price. To make her fast, the designers stripped away the armor. Her skin was thin. Basically, she was a glass cannon. She could dish out damage, but she couldn't take it. In November 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal was reaching its peak. The Japanese were trying to reinforce their troops on the island. The U.S. Navy had to stop them. On the night of Friday the 13th, yes, really, the two fleets collided in the dark. It wasn't a strategic naval battle, it was a knife fight in a phone booth. The ships were so close that they couldn't depress their guns low enough to hit the enemy hulls. They were firing into each other's bridges. The Juno was in the thick of it. Early in the fight, a Japanese torpedo slammed into her forward fire room. The explosion buckled the deck and broke her keel. She lost steering. She was crippled, but she didn't sink, not yet. The crew managed to limp away. The next morning, the Juno was retreating with a small group of battered American ships. The sun was up. The crew probably thought they had survived the worst of it. They were exhausted, drinking coffee and tending to the wounded. Then the ocean betrayed them. Lurking beneath the waves was the Japanese submarine E-26. The captain, Minoru Yokota, saw the American ships moving slowly. He lined up his shot. He fired a spread of torpedoes. Most of them missed, but one didn't. This torpedo was a Type 93, nicknamed the Long Lance. It was the most advanced torpedo of the war. It was oxygen-fueled, which meant it left no bubble trail. You couldn't see it coming, and it carried a massive warhead, nearly 1,100 pounds of high explosive. The torpedo was meant for another ship, the USS San Francisco. But it passed her and struck the Juno, and here's the horrifying part. It hit the Juno in the exact same spot where the first torpedo had hit the night before, but this time it punched through to the magazine. The magazine is where the ship stores tons of gunpowder and shells. The result was an earth-shattering detonation. The Juno didn't just break, she vaporized. A massive pillar of yellow and purple smoke shot 3,000 feet into the air. The captain of the USS Helena, who was watching from nearby, wrote in his log, "It was then that the Juno was blown up with all hands. The explosion was the most horrific I have ever seen. The ship completely disappeared in 42 seconds. Think about that number, 42 seconds. That is not enough time to launch a boat. It is not enough time to put on a life vest. It is barely enough time to realize you are dying." The submersible footage confirms this violence. The blast pressure was so intense it blew the metal outward. The ship was gutted from the inside. The bow and stern were severed instantly, sinking like stones. The explosion would have been instantaneous. They wouldn't have felt a thing. But for the men on the upper decks, the horror was just starting. About 100 men were blown into the water. They were alive, but they were swimming in a thick layer of fuel oil. The other American ships saw the explosion. They saw the smoke, and they made a cold, calculated decision. They assumed no one could survive a blast like that. They also knew a submarine was still hunting them. So the order was given, do not stop. The fleet sailed away. The survivors in the water watched the masts of their friends disappear over the horizon. They were alone in the middle of the Pacific, and they were floating in a place known for its sharks. The wreckage tells us how the ship died, but the survivors' accounts tell us how the nightmare truly began. The water was about to claim what the fire missed. The fatal mistake. This is the part of the story that makes you angry. It is the part that haunts the families to this day. When the Juno exploded, roughly 100 men survived the initial blast. They were dazed, burned, and covered in black oil. They clung to cargo nets, pieces of wood, and life rafts that had popped loose. They expected rescue to come within hours. They were wrong. Because of the threat of the submarine and a breakdown in communication, the Navy command didn't know there were survivors. A B-17 bomber flew over them and signaled the location, but the report got lost in a pile of paperwork at the headquarters. So the men waited. The sun in the South Pacific is brutal. It blistered their skin. The oil got into their eyes and their lungs. Thirst set in immediately. But the biggest threat wasn't the sun, it was the sharks. Iron Bottom Sound is notorious for shark populations. The vibrations of the explosion and the smell of blood in the water acted like a dinner bell. Hundreds of sharks swarmed the area. Survivors later reported that every night the screams would start. Men would be pulled under one by one. It was a lottery of death. You could be talking to a buddy and a second later he would be gone in a splash of red foam. But the psychological torture was worse. After a few days without water, the men started to hallucinate. They suffered from delirium. Some men imagined they saw land. They would swim away from the rafts, never to be seen again. Others imagined the ship was still there, just below the surface. They would dive down to get a cool drink of water from the mess hall and drown. One survivor remembered a sailor claiming he had a car parked nearby and was going to drive to get help. He swam off into the open ocean. It was total madness. Among the group was the youngest Sullivan brother, Albert. Survivors say he was alive for the first few days, but he was frantic with grief. He kept calling out for his brothers, "George, Frank," but the ocean only answered with a slap of waves. Eventually, Albert became delirious. He drowned or was taken by the sharks. No one knows for sure. By the time a PBY Catalina flying boat finally spotted them, 8 days later, only 10 men were left alive. 10 out of the original 100 survivors, and out of the nearly 700 crew members. When the rescuers pulled them out of the water, they were skeletons. They were covered in ulcers from the salt and oil. They were traumatized beyond words. The experts analyzing the wreck site know this context. When they look at the twisted metal on the ocean floor, they aren't just seeing steel, they are seeing the starting point of an 8-day horror movie. The delayed rescue was a scandal. The captain of the cruiser USS Helena, Captain Hoover, was relieved of command for leaving the scene, though many argued he was just following standard procedure to protect his ship from submarines. It remains a controversial topic in naval history. But the real weight of the tragedy landed in Waterloo, Iowa, a small town that had sent 5 of its best young men to war, only to lose them all in a single heartbeat. And that brings us to the legacy of the Juno. Because what happened next changed the rules of war forever. But deep down, the wreckage holds one more secret. It is about the strange way the ocean preserves the past, keeping it fresh, as if waiting for someone to return. The science of the deep is just as spooky as the history. The Sullivan Legacy. The loss of the USS Juno is unique because of the Sullivans, George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert. They were a tight-knit Irish Catholic clan. They did everything together. When Pearl Harbor happened, they marched down to the recruiting office. They had a letter from the Navy saying they should be separated. The brothers refused. They said, "We stick together." The Navy, desperate for positive publicity and men, agreed. It was a decision that would haunt the military. When the Juno went down, the Navy didn't tell the family immediately. In fact, the Sullivans kept writing letters to their boys for weeks. The letters were returned unopened. Rumors started swirling in their hometown. Finally, in January 1943, 3 officers knocked on the door of the Sullivan home. The father, Thomas, answered. He looked at the uniforms and asked, "Which one?" The officer replied, "I am sorry, all 5. The mother, Aletta, collapsed. The news sent shockwaves through America. It was the biggest single-family loss in U.S. military history. It was a PR nightmare and a national tragedy. Because of this, the U.S. War Department adopted the sole survivor policy. This set of regulations was designed to protect members of a family from the draft or combat duty if they had already lost siblings in service. It is the rule that the movie Saving Private Ryan is based on. So when the submersible reached the Juno, it was visiting a site that is sacred to American history. The footage showed the area where the brothers likely slept. It showed the mess deck where they ate. It brings a human scale to the massive industrial destruction. The experts treated the site with extreme caution. They didn't touch anything, they didn't take souvenirs. This is a war grave. The Sullivans are still there, entombed in the steel that they swore to defend. But there is a strange comfort in the discovery. For decades, the family had no grave to visit. Now, they have coordinates, they have images, they know where the boys are. But here is the deal. The discovery also highlighted something eerie about the ocean floor. The preservation of the wreck is almost supernatural. It doesn't look like it has been down there for 76 years. Why? The answer lies in the chemistry of the deep, and it explains why the experts were so silent when they saw the artifacts scattered in the debris field. It turns out the deep ocean is a freezer. Science at 4,000 meters. Most shipwrecks look like rust buckets. If you look at wrecks in shallow water, they are covered in coral, algae, and fish. They are being eaten alive by the ocean. But the USS Juneau sits at 4,200 meters. That is deep. At this depth, the ocean is a desert. There is no light. The temperature is near freezing, but the most important factor is oxygen, or rather, the lack of it. Rust is oxidation. It needs oxygen to happen. In the deep Pacific trenches, the oxygen levels are incredibly low. This means the chemical reaction that turns steel into orange dust happens in slow motion. This is why the footage from the submersible left the experts silent. They saw paint. They saw the Juno name clearly. They saw leather shoes lying on the mud that looked like they could still be worn. Leather is organic. In shallow water, bacteria would eat it in weeks. But down there, the bacteria are scarce and slow. The shoe sits there, a ghostly reminder of a sailor who ran out of his bunk and never made it. The Petrel's cameras zoomed in on the fire control directors. These are complex mechanical computers used to aim the guns. The gears, the glass dials, the brass fittings, they were pristine. It is a time capsule. This preservation allows historians to see exactly how the ship was configured. They can see the damage patterns in high definition. They can tell that the blast shields were bent outward, confirming the internal explosion. But it also makes the wreck feel alive. When you see a rusty blob, it looks like geology. When you see a ship with paint and portholes and shoes, it looks like a scene from yesterday. It bridges the gap of time. It makes the tragedy feel recent. The experts realize that the Juno will likely sit there, intact, for centuries. While the Titanic is disappearing, the Juno is staying. But with every mystery, there are wild theories. And the Juno has plenty. Because when a ship disappears in 42 seconds and the rescue is delayed for 8 days, people start to ask questions. Dark questions. And some of the theories about what really happened in Iron Bottom Sound are downright chilling. Wild theories of the abyss. Whenever a tragedy of this magnitude happens, it leaves a vacuum. And human nature hates a vacuum. We need answers. We need reasons. And when the official story doesn't quite add up, or when the horror is just too big to process, wild theories start to fill in the gaps. The USS Juno is a magnet for these theories. It is the Bermuda Triangle of the Pacific War. First, we have to talk about the cover-up theory. This is the one that makes people the most angry. There is a persistent, nagging belief among conspiracy theorists and even some historians that the rescue mission wasn't just botched by accident. They believe it was delayed on purpose. Why? To hide the absolute incompetence of the fleet commanders. Think about it. The admirals in charge were already terrified. The battle had been a mess. They were losing ships left and right. The theory goes that the high command knew the Sullivan brothers were all on board. They knew the 5 of them were the poster boys for the war effort. If 5 brothers died on one ship, it wouldn't just be a tragedy. It would be a PR disaster of epic proportions. It would crush morale back home. Some of the darker theories suggest that when the report came in that there were survivors in the water, the commanders hesitated. They waited. They hoped the ocean and the sharks would remove the evidence. If there were no survivors to tell the horror stories, the Navy could control the narrative. They could say the ship vaporized instantly and everyone died painlessly. Is it true? Almost certainly not. Hanlon's razor tells us not to attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity. The chaos of war explains the mistake. The fleet was running for its life. But The fact that the report from the B-17 bomber was lost for days is incredibly suspicious to many. A pilot sees men in the water, he radios it in, and that message just vanishes? It sits under a paperweight for days while men are being eaten alive? To many, that feels too convenient to be an accident. Then we move from the political to the mystical. We have the curse of the Sullivans. You have to remember, sailors are some of the most superstitious people on the planet. They believe in omens. They believe in luck. And to the old salts in the Navy, having 5 brothers on one ship wasn't patriotic. It was bad luck. It defied the natural order. It was tempting fate. There are stories, whispers really, that other sailors on the Juno felt a sense of doom before that final voyage. They claimed the ship felt heavy. They said the atmosphere on board had changed. Some crew members allegedly wrote letters home saying they felt marked. They felt like they were sailing in a coffin. It sounds like hindsight, but in the world of naval lore, ignoring a feeling is a fatal mistake. And then things get supernatural. The Juno rests in Iron Bottom Sound. Just the name gives you chills. It is said to be the most haunted stretch of water in the entire world. There are dozens of ships and thousands of dead sailors down there in the dark. Modern ships passing through the area have reported things that science can't explain. Strange electrical malfunctions that only happen over the wreck sites, radars lighting up with ghost fleets, showing blips of destroyers and cruisers that aren't there moving in formation. Sonar operators have reported hearing strange noises, not the groaning of metal settling on the sea floor. We are talking about sounds that resemble screams, or the frantic tapping of Morse code on hulls that haven't existed for 80 years. Some paranormal researchers believe that high concentrations of sudden, violent death create a spiritual energy, a psychic scar on the location. The Juno, being one of the most violent, instantaneous events in naval history, is the epicenter of this energy. It is a place where the veil is thin. And get this, there is a wild connection to the infamous Philadelphia experiment. If you don't know, the Philadelphia experiment is a massive conspiracy theory claiming that in 1943, the U.S. Navy was trying to make ships invisible using high-frequency magnetic fields. Some theorists look at the Juno, which sank in late '42, and connect the dots. They claim the technology wasn't just tested in Philadelphia, they argue it was being tested in the Pacific. The theory suggests that the Juno was carrying experimental anti-radar gear, or perhaps magnetic shielding meant to repel torpedoes. They argue that the Juno didn't just explode from ammunition, they say the explosion looked wrong. Witnesses said the ship didn't just break apart, it vaporized. It disappeared in a cloud of weirdly colored smoke in 42 seconds. To the conspiracy theorists, this wasn't a magazine detonation. This was a failure of a teleportation or cloaking test that destabilized the ship's molecular structure. It sounds crazy, right? It sounds like science fiction. But the way the ship was erased from the surface fuels these fires. It didn't look like a normal sinking. It looked like a glitch in reality. And finally, we have the cargo theory. This one is more grounded, but just as intriguing. What was the Juno really carrying? Some speculate she had more than just ammo on board. There are rumors of gold bullion meant to pay local resistance fighters in the islands. Or even more dangerous, secret code books. The Japanese submarine, I-26, was hunting in a target-rich environment. There were bigger, more valuable ships to hit. Yet the Japanese captain targeted the Juno aggressively. He ignored other opportunities to put a torpedo into her side. Was the Japanese captain acting on intelligence? Did he know something we didn't? If the Juno was carrying the purple code or classified intelligence on the upcoming offensives, she would have been a priority target. It would explain why she was hunted down. It turns the sinking from a random act of war into a targeted assassination. If this is true, it adds another layer to the tragedy. It means the men on board weren't just fighting a battle, they were guarding a secret that cost them their lives. Most historians reject these ideas. They say the magazine explosion explains the vaporization. They say the delay in rescue was just bureaucratic incompetence. They say the ghosts are just glitches. But the silence of the experts looking at the wreck might not just be respect. It might be the realization that we will never know the full truth. The evidence is scattered across the ocean floor, rusted and gone. The ocean keeps its secrets. It swallows the evidence. And the Juno is the ultimate vault. It holds the bodies, the truth, and the mystery locked away in the dark forever. Was the delayed rescue a mistake or a cover-up? Do you believe in the curse of Iron Bottom Sound? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deep-sea mysteries that keep you up at night, smash that like button and subscribe.